Thanks, Ahmed, and thanks to Islamic Events for putting together a very important event at an extremely critical and unprecedented time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. As we enter into the sacred month of Ramadan, there is something very different about this year, and it's unprecedented. It is for the first time in our lives, we don't have open access to the masjid. We won't have open access to Taraweeh and community and even family iftars or extended family iftars. So this is something brand new, and it has a lot of people shaken up. How do we respond to this? Is this a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger? These are kind of some of the feelings that people are having about this unprecedented event. And so what I want to talk about is just a little bit about what should kind of our focus be. How can we prepare our hearts to make the most of this Ramadan, and how should we view this situation? Because again, there's a lot of confusion and what does this mean? And when you assign meaning to something, it changes the way you respond to it. And so meaning is very important. How we view what is happening and why it's happening is essential in terms of how we respond. So how we understand what it is that is happening is essential in order to change our response. So the first principle that I want to discuss is part of the understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we need to have is that we always know with full certainty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always does good for the believer. This has to be part of our foundational understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Husn al-dhann billah, having a positive opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, completely changes how we respond to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us. The way we respond is absolutely affected by how we interpret who Allah is and what Allah does. Husn al-dhann billah means to always have a positive opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's to understand that Allah is always giving. Allah is always giving even when it looks like He is taking. Even when it looks like He's withholding, He is still giving. So, for example, entering into Ramadan and not being able to go to the masjid, for example, this feels like a massive deprivation. And in fact, it is a massive deprivation if it were you or I, if it was ourselves that were depriving us of the masjid, then in fact it would be a deprivation. But when that decision comes by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when that decision is by the will and qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is no longer a deprivation because Allah is always giving. And this is a principle that we learn, for example, in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ says that the matter of a believer is something miraculous or amazing, ajabun. And why? Because all of his affairs or her affairs are good. So this is why the Prophet ﷺ characterizes the matter of a believer as being something that is amazing, something that is wondrous. It's unusual, ajabun. Why? And then he goes on to say that this is not the case for anyone except for the believer. So this is an exclusive benefit, an exclusive rather privilege and gift that is given to the believer, which is that everything that happens to the believer is actually good for the believer. And then the Prophet ﷺ goes on to say that if something comes that gives the believer a reason to be happy, so something that we like, something that makes us happy, so then the believer responds with gratitude, and so it is good for the believer. And if something comes that's difficult, or that would make us sad, or something that was some sort of test or difficulty, the believer responds with patience, and so it is good for the believer. Now, what do we learn from this hadith? Number one principle is that everything Allah gives to the believer is actually good for the believer. That's the number one principle. The number two principle is that it all has to do with our response. Because if you notice that the Prophet ﷺ is explaining that it is about the response of the believer, because the believer is between gratitude when it's something that we like, and patience when it's something that we didn't choose, or we didn't ask for, or we didn't like. Now, how does that apply to entering Ramadan during a global pandemic where almost everyone is on lockdown? We can't go to the masjid, we can't go to these community gatherings, tarawih. These are things that we grew up getting used, that this is Ramadan, right? So how does it apply here? Well, number one is that firm belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what He's doing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done this for a reason, and most important, that it is actually for the good of the believer. Even in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ tells us that that plague, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends plague, the plague itself in the hadith says that it is actually a mercy for the believers. I mean, have we ever sat and actually reflected on that this unprecedented experience that we're going through, the Prophet ﷺ said is actually a mercy for the believers. Yes, he said it is a punishment for some, but it is a mercy for the believers. So now it brings us to the question of, well, which one is it? And how do I view this in my own experience? Am I being punished? There's a lot of that fear. So even for that case, so let's look at what happens when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is angry with a believer. So a believer can also make mistakes. I mean, obviously believers are not angels. Believers are not sinless. We also sin, and we can also make mistakes which anger Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that case, even in that case, deprivation can be a gift. And here is why. Because when the believer has earned the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deprives the believer, He does so in order to wake up that person, to wake up the believer, to inspire that person to come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to rectify themselves, to do tawbah and istighfar. Tawbah means to return to Allah, and istighfar means to repent. And so even when a believer has done wrong, and even when the believer has earned the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even in that case, the deprivation can be a gift, because it wakes us up and it inspires us to get our act together. Because sometimes we go through life and we kind of get into like an autopilot type of mode, right? We're living our lives, but we get maybe a little bit consumed by our dunya, right? Our jobs, our families, our parties, our fashion, whatever it is. We get sort of our careers. We get consumed. And so what happens is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes sends wake-up calls. Now those wake-up calls are not punishments for a believer. They are wake-up calls. They are gifts, because they are reminding the believer to rectify themselves before it is too late. And so even that we can view as a blessing, as a gift. So whichever way you look at it, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decided something for us as believers, whichever way you look at it, it is actually good for us. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving to the believer. It is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to punish us. We have to think positive of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what husn al-dhann billah means. It means that we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing things for us, not against us. It's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala against us. We have to always see that we are trying to be on the team of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that Allah is on our team. It doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't mean that Allah is always going to be happy with us. I mean, think about a parent. Is a parent always happy with their child? Does a child never anger the parent? Does a child never make a mistake? Absolutely not. That's impossible. But what does a loving, merciful parent do when the child makes a mistake or when the child's going down the wrong path? Well, a loving, merciful parent will discipline them, will try to bring them back, will do things to wake them up. And sometimes it comes in a form that looks like punishment, but in fact it is a mercy. In fact, it is out of the mercy of that parent who wants good for that child. And remember that Allah is high above any analogy, and Allah's mercy for us is infinitely greater than a mother's mercy for her child. So we have to look positive at this, and we have to enter Ramadan with a fresh perspective and a positive perspective of, okay, Allah has chosen this. And that should be enough for us to have certainty that it is good for us. Allah has chosen this. That's what we have to focus on. This is not Trump chose this. This is not Boris Johnson chose this. This is not I chose this, not you chose this. This isn't the leaders of the world who chose this. This is our Creator who chose this. So be careful not to see the actors, right? Do not see the puppets. You have to see who is in control. You know, I've heard a lot of news about people being very angry about, for example, the masjids being closed and maybe some of this anger. And I've seen other news about a lot of anger directed at leaders, at the World Health Organization. You know, there's a lot of misplaced sort of anger. There's a lot of us looking for scapegoats. But if we can just understand, number one, who's actually in charge, but most importantly, that the one who's in charge does not want harm for us. It isn't our enemy. It isn't, someone who we don't trust, but it is someone who has more mercy for us than our own mother, who is in charge. So that should give us peace, and that should give us rest, knowing that even when we don't understand, it is still for our own good. I can guarantee that children, when they're disciplined by their parent, or when the parent makes a decision for the protection or rectification or tarbiyah of that child a lot of times has no idea. I mean, a lot of children will rebel. A lot of children will be very angry because they don't see what the parent is doing for them. But the reality is that the parent is protecting that child. The parent is raising that child. That's what tarbiyah is. Sometimes we do things for a child which they don't like, right? We have to intervene because that's our job as parents, to raise a child. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is raising all of us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is developing and teaching and purifying all of us. He's our Creator. So sometimes we won't understand, but we have to have faith. And we have to have certainty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing what He knows as what is best for us in that given situation. And it doesn't mean that it's always best for us. I mean, this isn't to say it's always best not to go to the masjid in Ramadan. No, it's just by Allah's wisdom and Allah's knowledge and divine wisdom, which we don't know and we can't conceive of, that He has decided that at this time, this is what is best, and that's what is happening. And so the decision of Allah, قَدَّرَ اللَّهُ مَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ, that whatever Allah wills, that is what will happen, that's what He will do. He makes a decision, and whatever He decides, He does. And so we have to submit, but also with positivity, not just submit, but have a negative attitude and feel like, God, I'm being punished, and why is God doing this to me, and it's not fair, and this is awful. And no, that's all very negative thinking about Allah. We have to think positive about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how can we practically kind of look at this, I suppose. So there's a spiritual way to look at this, and that is to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it is not the people, it is not the regulation, but it is not even it's not even a disease, but it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's made a decision, and it is for our own good. And seeing that Allah has more mercy for us than our own mother has for us. What are some of the practical ways that we can look at this? Well, and Allah knows best, But there are some things that we can look at it and see that perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could be teaching us, and perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could be training us. Many of us, when Ramadan comes around, mashallah, we get involved with the community, we go to the masjid a lot, but sometimes family time gets sort of hurt, where even the iftars, God bless the communities and everything, but vast majority of the iftars put men on one side and women on the other. And while it's important to have gender segregation, but where's the family time gone, right? You're always spending the time with other women, which is great and it's important, but where is the family time? And so this is one aspect, or sometimes they don't even have family iftar. Sometimes just the men go, for like a singles iftar, even though they're not single. Sometimes ironically, Ramadan becomes a time where you don't see your family much. You don't maybe eat with your family much. Even when you're going to iftars, you're not with your family. The reality is that even when you go to community iftars, or you go to masjid iftars, or you go to family iftars, where again it's the women talk to the women and the men talk to the men, and again that's important, but it does beg the question, where is the family time? And so one outcome, and we can see this as a positive outcome from this, is that now you got family time, right? I have personally, I have family members who, for example, spent the last 30, 40 years of their life, fathers, grandfathers spent the last 30, 40 years of their life working 7 days a week. And this is the first time that he's able to actually just be home with his family. So he told us that, this is a blessing for him. This is actually an opportunity for him to finally feel almost young again. That's what he said. He says he feels young again because for the first time, he's not working 7 days a week and he can actually be home with his family. So for some people, that is an outcome which we can see as positive. That now iftar is with your family, whether you like it or not, it's a chance for you to sit down and to actually hopefully bond with your family. Hopefully it's not a time of tension and fights. Inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put sakina, peace and tranquility in our homes, and just to see it like that. And then finally, and I want to inshallah end with this reflection, and that is that perhaps it is a lesson that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not confined to any place or time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only confined to the masjid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only confined to Ramadan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can call on Him at any time and in any place. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closer to us than our jugular vein. We do not limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is with us wherever we are, as He tells us in the Quran. And so perhaps this is an opportunity for us to build that personal connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, we have been barred from the communal worship, but perhaps it is an opportunity for us to taste the sweetness of private worship, of personal, private time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, an opportunity to really build a one-on-one relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that personal time with Allah, in tahajjud. Realize that Taraweeh is just tahajjud, but it's done in the masjid to help people and to encourage people to participate in it. Those who aren't maybe strong in Quran, who don't have Quran memorized. But realize that essentially Taraweeh is tahajjud prayer. And the Prophet ﷺ would pray it at home. So we are not being deprived of that. We still can pray tahajjud, and we still should pray tahajjud. And so we need to maybe refocus on our personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now that we are barred from the communal, we are barred from the jama'ah. So it gives us that opportunity to really focus on our personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and maybe that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to do now, to get that time to focus back on building the bonds with our family, having that time which maybe we wouldn't otherwise have in Ramadan with our families, and to realize that Allah is not confined by place or by time, that He is closer than our jugular vein, and to learn and really build that personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and now that we don't have the opportunity to have the jama'ah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم سبحانك الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Jazakumullahu khairan. And now back to Ahmed.